All right. Well, thank you again for joining us this evening. This is the final study of our Acts series that we've been talking about for the last, I guess, 12 weeks. So this is great. Thank you for sticking with it. And if you've missed some, all of these are online, so you can go back and watch them for your viewing pleasure. Of course, everybody's going to be excited about that. And before I forget, there is a trip to Greece that is going from the chapel, and 10 more spots have opened up. And so we've already got a big group going, but there's some additional spots open and they just opened it up. So if that's of interest, contact the church office and we'll help you get connected with the people who can tell you more about it. Okay, we're going to be in chapter 27 of Acts, but before we start there, I want to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. While Paul is traveling all over the world, or the known world, the Roman Empire, planting churches, he's also writing letters to his churches. Fortunately, we have some of those letters, and we've got 13 of them in Scripture. But there's a whole lot more, and inside those letters is, it says, "Hey, didn't you read my letter to the Laodiceans?" Well, we don't have the letter to the Laodiceans. We're looking for it, but we don't have it. So he's writing letters to the churches. And sometimes the church, if they would have a question, like a problem that they didn't know how to solve, they would send a message. They'd get a message to Paul, and Paul would respond with a letter and he'd write. Sometimes when he's on his missionary journeys, he'd just make a personal stop. But most of the time, he's writing these letters. Sometimes in these letters, he talks a little bit about himself. So, in other words, a lot of the information that we have about the person of Paul, we actually get it from his letters, because as he's writing to these churches, he's saying, I once was a young boy and blah, 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 blah. And we're like, oh gosh, we never knew that, because Luke, who is the author of Acts, Luke is not going to tell us too much about the boyhood of Paul, because it doesn't matter to Luke at that point. But in chapter 12, he's talking to the Corinthians. And the Corinthians are, I'm going to point to it. This is where it is on our map. This is Corinth. I'm pointing to it on online at the end of Greece. And Corinth is in between these two large bodies of water. And nobody likes sea travel. It's exceptionally dangerous. And so what a lot of shippers used to do was they would bring their cargo from wherever they're come into the Gulf and dock at Corinth. And at Corinth, there is a 3-mile wide road that separates these two bodies of water. And so what they would do is they would pull the boats up on one side and they would drag their boat 3 miles to the other side. That's how much they hated sea travel. And we're going to see that with Paul coming up in just a minute. And so Corinth was an unruly town. It's got a church in it, but it's got every sort of hillbilly Yahoo that you can come up with of the known world. That's where all the brothels and casinos and just anything and everything goes in Corinth. And so Corinth is they're kind of like the problem child sort of thing. Oh gosh, and here I just got another note from Corinth. Like, oh Lord, Timothy, don't bring me any more letters from Corinth, okay? But that's who he's writing to. So let's take a look at verse 7, and I'm in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, because we learned something about Paul as he's talking to the Corinthians. And we're in the middle of a sentence. It says, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations, here we go. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me and to keep me from being too elated. And so it is of great discussion among theologians about what the thorn in Paul's side is. Because we know, for instance, that Luke, who is writing the story of Acts, is traveling with Paul for much of his travels. Luke is a doctor. So whatever Paul's issue is, it could be irritable bowel syndrome, it could be migraine headaches, it could be emphysema, it could be all kinds of issues that we don't know what it is. But my guess is that everybody has got some kind of problem that we wish we didn't have, some kind of physical problem that we wish that we didn't have to deal with. And what do you do when you have that problem and you're a person, even if you're a little bit faithful? I mean, eventually you might just get, if you can't do any, if you can't get off the pot, eventually you may offer God a prayer, even if you don't believe in God. God, please take this away and I'll go to church every day. But watch what Paul does. Verse 8. And this is chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. That's a Bible verse that gets quoted all the time. And Paul's talking about it because he's got whatever this issue is, physically, we think, whatever this issue he wishes he didn't have, and what God's either said no or something. And in this case, you know what? My grace is sufficient for you, Paul, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell within me. Therefore, I am content with my weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. All right, that's a big build-up kind of Bible. No matter as beat down as we can get, that's when we're strong. But Paul's telling this to the Corinthians. Now, there is a whole group of theologians, enough to at least mention, that think that Paul's thorn in his side is not a physical ailment at all. There's plenty of people that think the physical ailment is the Corinthian church, that they are just, he doesn't know what, he loves them because they're believers, but he just doesn't know what to do with. They are, so there's lots of people that say what he's doing is he's kind of poking fun. He's not telling them what the thorn is because they're the thorn. But we just don't know. We just know that Paul's got something big, and most theologians think that it is a physical thing. And this is just something that Paul is dealing with throughout his journeys. And just like we deal with all kinds of stuff throughout our life's journeys, physical stuff, mental stuff, emotional stuff that we wish that we didn't have to deal with, but we do. And we have to kind of figure out life around it. And Paul's saying that very same thing to the Corinthians. He's saying, don't think I'm perfect because I've got all kinds of problems, but I have learned to be able to work with it. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second, but let's turn over to Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. Back to our story with Paul and his irritable bowel syndrome, or whatever he happens to have, because they don't have Pepto. That will create problems. And they don't have toilet paper either. They're using something else. So that is not going to be pleasant. That is going to be a thorn in your side. So chapter 27 in Acts, and Paul has appealed to Caesar. And so now he is finally going to get to Rome, where he has always wanted to go. So behind me, if you're online, I've got the map of Paul's journey. And he's going to start down here at the bottom. I can't even see my finger on there. Let's see if I can. Oh, he's going to start down here at the bottom and then come up. Okay. And so what we're doing is we're about to rattle through a bunch of names, and all these names are names of the stops. So I'm going to get out of the picture a little bit in case y'all are on computer screens. Y'all will actually be able to read some of that. Chapter 27, when it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, they transferred, now this is important, they transferred Paul and some of the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Luke, who is writing this down, mentions a centurion specifically by name. And the only reason he's going to mention a centurion by name is if he likes him, right? You're going to give your friends a shout out, the ones who took care of you. Luke, keep this in mind, this journey is going to take place in the year 60 AD. And so Luke is writing this down sometime after that, in 65 AD or 70 AD or 75 AD. 5, 10, 15 years later is when Paul's writing this, or is when Luke is writing this account. Luke knows exactly how this story is going to go, right? He knows what's going to happen. And so he's going to call out important names and or places that he knows. Some of the details he mentions, he's going to mention because he knows that they were important for some reason. Okay. And verse 2, embarking on a ship of Adramyttium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea. You see that pronoun shift? It started with they put Paul and the other prisoners on the boat, and now it is we. So Luke has now joined the boat. So now we have a first account, an eyewitness account of the stuff. We put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, and Thessalonica is up here, and all that's doing is that saying that he was born up yonder, but his home is now in Thessalonica, and now he's down here making the journey with us. It's like saying, he's a Georgia, he's a Georgian, but he was born in Arkansas. Okay. All right. So verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, which is at the bottom of the map. If you're online, you can't even see it. It's at the very bottom. We put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. Okay, so here we're over here. And after we had sailed across the sea, that is off of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia, which is this yellow, my first yellow arrow if you're online. This is where they are now. So he just described the movement from right here. So now he's there at Myra. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship, and Alexandria is the capital of Egypt, which is due south at the tip of Africa. They found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy. So what was happening? Trade goods went from Alexandria to Myra. Part of the goods were unloaded. And before that ship launched to Italy, Paul and that whole group found out about it, and so they're hopping boats now. So they're changing boats right here, and they're getting on a freighter that's an Alexandrian freighter, but now that's what they're going to board trying to get to Italy. Okay. Sailing past, let's see, and verse 7. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmon. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, which is near the city of Lycia. And so Fair Havens, I keep leaning the wrong way. Fair Havens is over here on Crete. This is Fair Havens right here. Okay. So what Luke is saying is that the journey from Myra this way, he says, with trouble, that it was not helpful. Now, one thing that we don't know about the Mediterranean is that in the months of November, December, and January, you do not travel on the sea in first century world. That's when the seas are the roughest. And so all the seaports actually close, but they believe they close from November the 1st to February the 1st. Nobody traveled then. And here's where the problem is. Verse 9, since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous because even the fast had already gone by. The fast he's talking about is Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur happens in late September. So they started this journey sometime about Yom Kippur. They were right up against the period of time that you don't travel, okay? But here's what happens. Sometimes hurricane season comes early. Sometimes it's late, and in this case, it comes early for these guys. Paul advised them, saying, sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with great danger and with heavy loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than to what Paul had said. And here's the reason why. because if they don't get to Italy, they're going to be stuck on Crete until February the 1st. And it is now mid-October or something like that, because you don't travel in those months at all. So they're kind of they're trying to get there in a hurry. So of course the ship's captain and the ship's owner are going to say no, because I am not waiting until February to get paid. I've got to get paid now. The whole purpose of the ship to leave Alexandria when it did was probably to make sure and get to Italy before the hurricane season hit. Okay, and I'm using hurricane, I'm just using lightly because those are terms we understand. Okay, so verse 11, but the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than what Paul said. Verse 12, since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix. And all they're trying to do is they're trying to hop from the middle of Crete to the end of Crete, which is just right next to it. So obviously there's nothing to do where they were. And they said, if we can get to Phoenix, we might be able to hang out there for 3 months, but we do not want to spend 3 months in this place. Where they could spend the winter, and it was a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest. Verse 13, when a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought they could achieve their purpose. So they weighed anchor and they began to sail past Crete close to the shore. But soon a violent wind called the northeaster rushed down from Crete. And since the ship was caught and could not be turned head into the wind, we gave into it and we were driven. So what happens is they're just trying to hop around on Crete from the middle of Crete to the end of Crete, and they get caught by a northwest wind. Let's see, it's opposite on the camera. The northwest wind, which is going to be coming this direction. And so when it catches them, it's going to start blowing them south. Okay, but there's a little island right here. There's an island in between them, and that's what we're about to see. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head into the wind, we gave into it and we were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, which is this little bitty island off of Crete. So they're going to try to hang on and stop there, but they were scarcely able to get the ship under control. And after hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. So what they did is, undergirding the ship, they took rope and they tied it around the boat to hold it together. Okay, and that was part of regular seamanship in first century, is to make sure the boat doesn't explode in the weather. You run rope around it and tighten it up to try to hold the whole thing. Okay. Then, fearing that they would run on the Citrus, and this Citrus is the reef on the north coast of Africa. So they think that they're in so much trouble, they're going to be blown all the way across the Mediterranean due south, and they're going to run into the reefs of Africa, which is a bad option too. This is verse 18, we were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw cargo overboard, and on the third day with their own hands they threw the ship's tackle overboard. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So Luke, in writing this story, says that after it was so bad, the storm was so bad, they weren't sure enough if it's day or night. Have we been out for a week? Have we been out for 10 days? And at this point, they have lost hope that they're going to survive. Verse 27, when the 14th night had come, now he gets a specific. As we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took soundings and they found 20 fathoms. And a little further, they took soundings again and they found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and they prayed for day to come. But when the sailors tried to escape, what they did was they dropped anchors because they were afraid they were going to run ashore. And the sailors tried to get to the They had tried to escape from the ship, and they lowered the boat into the sea. So what are they doing? They're the lifeboat. The sailors go to the lifeboat and said, enough, because the storm is still terrible. So the sailors go to the lifeboat on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow. And Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. The soldiers believed Paul. Mine doesn't say that, but that's what happened. They believed Paul, and they cut away the ropes of the lifeboat and let it go away. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food. So they have not been eating. Thoughts about why they have not been eating? Roughs, they are all sicker than sick. And when this doesn't mean that they didn't eat anything, but you know what it's like when you're sick. You're eating enough.
They were on rough seas.
Yeah, they're sailors. Yeah. And so these were professional sailors who know something about sea travel, and they are sicker than all. And when you're that sick, you're looking for Pepto and ginger ale or whatever will get you through it. But it ain't good. Okay. And so Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense and remaining without food and have eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive. For none of you will lose a hair from your heads. So this is important right here. And remember, Luke is writing this years later. And what Luke is doing is he's analyzing the whole journey, right? And he was keeping a log so that when he wrote the story later, he'd know but he's keeping log of everything. But Luke is also, it's like when we're writing a story or telling a story of a situation, there's a point in our experience that was a turning point or a big moment, but we don't know it necessarily when it's happening. We don't know it until after the fact, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so look at what Luke says. Let's say that Luke is writing this in the year 70 AD, okay, which would be the average of what most scholars think. 10 years after all of this happened. After Paul had said this, he took the bread and giving thanks to God, he broke it and he began to eat. So what does that make you think of? Communion, Lord's Supper. So Luke, in writing this, let's say it's in the year 70 or close to it, and in the environment of the church and where he is, even by that moment, communion is beginning. But Luke can look back at it and say, that is when the situation changed. Does that make sense? And so the church has put huge emphasis on this passage because Luke is able to look back at it and say, that is the point to where God intervened and came into the situation. And then all of them were encouraged and they took food for themselves. And we were in all 276 people on the ship. And after they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. Now, I mean, I'd imagine that's pretty dramatic, not knowing how you're going to survive all this. But Luke, of course, is reporting this much, much later. Verse 39. In the morning, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. And so they cast off their anchors and they left them in the sea. The reason I love thinking about Luke I write a lot. And so in writing, you're thinking about experiences and different things that happened and certain details that became important. And I mean, I'll think of detail. Oh my gosh, that was a God moment right there. And I've never thought about it until now. And after they have communion, after Paul breaks bread, which is the same thing that Jesus did, and they're not calling it communion, they're not calling it the Lord's Supper, but that's what Paul is driving us to. That's what Luke for sure is driving us to. Luke, again, he knows how the story goes. He knows what's about to happen. So the next morning they see a beach that looks good. And so they cast off the anchors, verse 40, and they left them in the sea. So they just cut the anchors away. And at the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars. And then the hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach, but they struck a reef. They ran the ship aground, and the bow struck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the force of the wave. So they beach themselves on the reef. The waves start to tear the boat apart. The soldiers' plan, verse 42, was to kill the prisoners. And the reason you kill the prisoners is if you're a soldier and your prisoner escapes, you're going to be executed. And we had seen that example before earlier in the book of Acts. So that none may swim away and escape. But the centurion, again, Centurion Julius, our friend that Luke had mentioned a while ago, verse 43, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, he kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest to follow, some on planks and other pieces of the ship. In other words, he says, if you can swim, get out now. And if you can't swim, we got to find something for you, a board or something to where you can float and paddle yourself in. And so it was that everyone was brought safely to land. So chapter 28. And after we had reached safety, we then learned that the island was called Malta. And Malta is way, okay, I'm going the wrong, way over here. That's how far they'd been blown. And so let me get out the picture. That is all the way across. That is a long haul from one end to the other.
14 days.
Do what?
It's 14
Yes,
days.
yeah. On the 14th, yeah. So they got blown to the island of Malta. And the natives there showed us unusual kindness. And I'm like a shadow to them. So I better get over here. So the natives showed us unusual kindness. And since it had begun to rain and it was cold, they kindled a fire and they welcomed all of us around it. Paul had gathered a bundle of brushwood and was putting it on the fire when a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. And when the natives saw the creature hanging from Paul's hand, they said to one another, this man must be a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. And justice, what they're referring to is the goddess Justice, because everybody's got a goddess of justice. And her name is Themis in Greek mythology. She's Zeus's second wife. And if you're an attorney or you know any attorneys or you happen to be married to a judge or something like that, then there's a chick that holds a set of scales that attorneys use on their letterhead all the time. A girl in gold that's holding, that's her. But Egypt also has a goddess of justice. Her name is Ma'at, and they're kind of caught in between, you know, because they're real close to Africa as well. So whatever, they're saying the goddess Justice, okay, that's what they're referring to. She's not allowed him to live. Verse 5, he, and that is Paul, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were expecting him to swell up and drop dead. But after they had waited a long time and saw that nothing unusual had happened to him, they changed their minds and they began to say that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It so happened that the father of Publius lay sick in bed with a fever and with dysentery. And Paul visited him and cured him by praying and putting his hands upon him. And after this happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They bestowed many honors upon us. And when we were about to sail, they put us on board and gave us everything we needed. So I think that's great when Luke is remembering this and putting this down on paper, remembering that transformative evening where Paul broke bread and how the next day they're saved by these island natives who they become friends with and who supply them with everything they need to make the rest of their journey. Okay. So 3 months later, verse 11, we set sail on a ship that had wintered on the island, an Alexandrian ship with the twin brothers as its figurehead. And the twin brothers are the Roman gods of the sea, Pollux and Castor. And so this is one of those things where Paul, who is deeply, very faithful person, a follower of God for sure, follower of Jesus Christ for sure, and he's looking at the boat, and the two figures sticking their heads off the front of the boat are Roman gods. And so does that offend Paul? No. He could care because they're meaningless. There's nothing to it. Just because it happens to be a boat from wherever, and if everybody on board believes in these two Roman gods, big deal. That doesn't mean that God is not going to go with Paul wherever Paul goes, right? I know some people, I can't do that because I might get tainted, or somebody will rub up against me and I'll get contagious with some spiritual mess. No, if God is with you, God is with you wherever you happen to be. So, okay. Verse 12, we put in at Syracuse and stayed there for 3 days. And that's what's happening over here, everybody on the map. So they were at Syracuse. That's the first stop after Malta. And then we came to Rhegium. And after that, after 1 day, there was a south wind sprang up. And on the second day, we came to Puteoli. So he comes all the way up to here. And there we found believers. And who are the believers? So the church, and the church we're talking about is going to be the Jewish church, the Hebrew church, those who would have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Now, here's kind of what we have to remember, is that 11 years before, this is 60 AD, and we talked about it. In the year 49 AD, Emperor Claudius, Caesar Claudius, expelled all the Hebrews from Italy and sent them to wherever. And Paul bumped into and met several of them on his missionary journeys. This is now 11 years later. So, and every time Paul, when he arrives at a new land, he always goes to the synagogue, and he goes to synagogue, and that's where he preaches. And he's preaching Hebrew theology with Jesus as the Messiah. That's what he's doing. He's not converting or trying to tell people to not be Hebrew. Be Hebrew. So he goes to the Hebrew church, which means the emperor in 60 AD had obviously allowed, or somebody in one of the emperors had allowed the Hebrews to come back. Does that make sense? Except that the Caesar that's in charge, his name is Nero, and he is a real knucklehead. Do y'all know who Nero is? History of the World Part 1, Dom DeLuise plays Hero. And everybody's Gregory Peck and Mel Brooks is in there. Madeline Kahn is Nero's. Yeah. And I mean, oh my God. And he takes a treasure bath. Oh my gosh, it's rowdy. And you just have to be, I love it, but you have to be careful who you watch it with. And so anyway, so that's who's in charge. And Nero in 3 years is going to burn half the city down because he's an idiot. And he's going to blame it on the Christians, but we ain't there yet. Okay. Paul in 60 AD, now it is early 61 AD. It's going to be in February-ish, maybe March, because they had to wait the winter out. Okay. And he's at Puteoli for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. And the believers from there, when they heard of us, they came as far from the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. And so what the map shows is they're in Puteoli, and then they go to Rome, and people are coming from far and wide, traveling great distances because they hear that Paul is there. His fame has certainly preceded him. Okay. Okay. And when we came to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself. This is verse 16, with the soldier who was guarding him. So I wonder if that was Julius, if that was the centurion. Now, centurions they're high-fluting people, but maybe the centurion thought something different. 3 days later, this is verse 17, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, that is, Paul. And when they had assembled, he said to them, brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs or our ancestors, yet I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. When they had examined me, the Romans wanted to release me because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But when the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to the emperor. even though I had no charge to bring against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and to speak with you, since it is for the sake of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain. Verse 21. And they replied, we have received no letters from Judea about you. So Paul is trying to kind of eliminate the conspiracy before it ever happens. And what they're saying is that we have not heard about those accusations. They've heard of Paul, but they have not heard of all of that. And they replied, we have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here have reported or spoken anything evil about you. Verse 22. But we would like to hear from you what you think, for with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. And what Paul is talking about, the sect, is Jesus as the Messiah, as the Hebrew Messiah. And they're saying, we want to hear about it. We have heard that it's, radical. We've heard that it's very different, but we want to hear it from you. Verse 23, after they had set a day to meet with him, they came to him at his lodgings in great numbers. And from morning until evening, he explained the matter to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. Some were convinced about what he said, while others refused to believe. So even now, through all of this, and Paul is so faithful, he's the greatest preacher to have ever lived and can do anything and everything, still in a room full of people, when he is delivering God's message, only a portion of them are believing. And one of the things that's hard sometimes, I think, about us, and when we're thinking about telling people about God or telling people about our relationship with the Lord, and we're discussing things like that, part of, I think, some of the issues we face is, oh my goodness, what if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm crazy? What if they stop liking me? Because, what if they say no? And in all of Paul's journeys, we see a lot of people that say, absolutely not. You're nuts. That is not. But in all of those seeds that he's throwing, there are some that do. So some were convinced what he had to say. Others refused to believe. So verse 25. So they disagreed with each other. And as they were leaving, Paul made one further statement. The Holy Spirit was right in saying to our ancestors through the prophet Isaiah, go to this people and say, you will indeed listen, but never understand, and you will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes so that they may not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. This is Isaiah chapter 6. And so even in the midst of Jesus, when Jesus is doing incredible, wonderful, beautiful things, people seeing the miracles happen, they still didn't believe. And one of the things Jesus says is, early in the ministry, Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2. And he says, go on and go tell people about the good news of God, and don't take anything except your shoes and your walking stick. Don't take food, don't take money, but you rely upon the hospitality of anybody and everybody that you come into contact with. And then somebody says, what if they don't like us? I'm assuming somebody said that, because Jesus immediately says, if they don't like you, shake the dust off your feet and head on down the road. Why? Because they're not your responsibility. When we share the message, the good news, that's our responsibility. What others do with it is not ours. That's on them. That is between them and God. We have done our very best in trying to share the good news. And that's a hard thing to remember. I mean, it just, especially today, I mean, people are very timid about talking about their faith, and we even if there's not a barrier, even if there's not a roadblock, we'll create it so that we don't have to do it. And I think this is a helpful thing to remember, is that if we share our our testimony. And you don't have to get there and say, I was once a sinner and I was terrible. Now I'm cured. But if we share the good news and they don't want to receive it, they don't want to receive it. But the thing is that as we do it, there will be those who do. That's the whole, Jesus talks about scattering the seeds, the parables where some of the seeds fall on the ground, some of them fall in the bushes and the thorns, some of them get eaten by the birds, but there's a few of them that land on good soil and they produce more than all the others combined. That's what Jesus is trying to get us to understand. And that's exactly what Paul is doing. He is everywhere he's going. He is sharing that good news. And it's interesting because Luke is looking at this. You know, Luke is part of Paul's crew and he's watching Paul do all this. And he can see the disagreement. He can see, and he probably hears people talking when Paul can't hear him talking, you know. Luke he's probably, I mean, he's been with him for like 25 years now. And so Luke may be, you know, he may not even get up there with Paul. He may stay back by the door because he thinks the best conversation is in the back of the, is always in the back of the sanctuary. That's where you hear the best stuff or the worst stuff, depending on how you look at it. Okay. And so, yeah. And so verse 28, so let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, they will listen. And so here's what Paul says, is he says, God brings this good news to you, Hebrew nation. And if you don't want to accept it, God offers it to those who will, which includes probably all of us, because we're not going to be part of the Hebrew nation. Okay. First, the Messiah comes as the Messiah to God's chosen people. But if not everyone responds, then it's going to, you know, if the nation's not going to respond, then God opens it up to everybody. And that's what Jesus does. When the curtain is torn, when Jesus dies on the cross, the curtain that is torn in the temple is supposed to symbolize that the barriers that keep the rest of us out are now broken. We now have full access to God anytime we want it and anytime that we can absolutely have it. And that's what Paul's saying. He's saying, if you don't accept it, so be it. But the people who are outside the door or your neighbor who believes in Zeus, he might accept it and he's welcome to because God's going to offer it to him. Verse 30. And he, that is Paul, lived there 2 whole years at his own expense, which means Paul rented a place, okay? But he was under house arrest, and he welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. So that is the end of chapter 28. Now, what happens after that? Then now the discussion begins. There are some churches, something called Acts 29, which is like okay, well, there's not an Acts chapter 29. Well, some churches have adopted that as kind of their theme, as kind of their purpose, is that now is when the work begins. Now is when the good stuff really begins. It's the next, it's the next phase. And scholars have all kinds of thoughts about what happens. So theory 1, which is the predominant theory, is that Paul is going to live for another couple of years and then he is going to be executed. Okay, that is theory number 1. We know that Nero is going to burn Rome in 63 AD. We also know that Peter is already in Rome when Paul arrives. And we know that Peter is going to be executed before Nero burns Rome. Peter is going to be executed by crucifixion upside down. Peter is crucified because Peter is not a Roman. Romans don't crucify Roman people. Crucifixion is of great suffering and terrible torment. If you're Roman and you're sentenced to death, it will not be by crucifixion. Jesus dies by crucifixion because he's not Roman. Peter is crucified upside down because he says, I'm not worthy to be crucified like Jesus, so put me upside down. And so they very happily do. And they and they turn the cross upside down and execute Peter. Paul, we believe, because he's a Roman citizen, if he's executed, he's going to be beheaded. Okay.
Oh, that's how they did it.
Yes. And so one of the theories or one of the traditions in Rome is that when Paul is beheaded, his head bounces 3 times and a natural spring springs up for each place where his head hit. Apparently that's there. I haven't seen it, but apparently that's there. So option 1 is that's what happens to Paul. Option 2 is that Paul is not convicted by the Roman court because nobody's been able to convict him yet. And that Caesar, whether it's Caesar hears his case or not, is that Caesar actually sets him free. And if that's the case, Paul goes to somewhere he's always wanted to visit, and that is the far western part of the world. Westeros is what we say in Game of Thrones, as far west as we can go. And that's Spain. Somewhere, somebody starts the church in Spain, and they can't trace it anywhere except potentially Paul. Okay. So those are the dominant options about what happens to Paul after these 2 years, because Acts ends. Obviously, when Luke is writing this story or writing this part of the story, we would think he doesn't know. We would think Paul's still alive.
Right, you would think so.
We would think so.
Either
But
that he read chapter 29 and
or either that or the rest of the books we don't have. Could be. We, all that's not quite sorted out. We've been kind of guessing that Luke was writing this maybe in the year 65, 70, or 75 AD, which he would have known what had happened to Paul, almost definitely. And why wouldn't we know it here? So some scholars would say, well, Luke's not going to talk about that because Luke doesn't find that important, and everybody knows what happened to Paul anyway. And what Luke's telling them is what they don't know, and that's how the church started. Because by the time that Luke is putting that down, they know all the big stories. We don't get the story of Peter. We find that in other historical sources. We don't get that in the Bible either. Why? Maybe because everybody already knows it. And so, okay, so that is how Acts finishes up. Acts chapter 28. So thoughts, questions, comments, everything's legal. We finished the whole book of Acts. Isn't that amazing? So I know there's much rejoicing.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Why would Luke be allowed to be on the ship with Paul? Because I realized it was a cargo ship, but weren't they just basically hauling prisoners?
No, for whatever reason, Paul, he's always under very loosely guarded constraints. He might be handcuffed, for instance, when he's in the court, but as we're actually told, Paul was given a lot of freedom on the ship. And so there was probably someplace in the ship, a hold or something, where they say, okay, we can hold the prisoners there, but there's going to be other passengers as well, not just prisoners. And so the way Luke began this discussion back in 27 is Luke says, Paul and the other prisoners were brought on board the ship, and then we all left together. But the centurion Julius allowed Paul to not be contained in the stock. So Paul was given the freedom to roam on the ship by Julius. And Paul, when he gets to Rome, it's the same thing. Paul's under arrest, or when he's in Corinth and in prison, or when Ephesus is in prison, he's writing all his letters, he's getting information in, he's sending information out. So for whatever reason, and it may be just a divine reason, Paul is given throughout his entire incarceration, even when he's in Caesarea and for 2 years in the change of governorship and everything, he's given freedom to be able to communicate and send letters and talk to people and whatever else. He can't leave, but they can bring him food. They can do all sorts of things. So it's not like the maximum security prison that we would think. And it may just be because they knew that Paul was not a flight threat. He wanted to go to Rome, and he's getting a free trip to Rome because he's a prisoner. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of it. Other thoughts, questions, comments, anything?
Pastor,
Yes. Hi, Mara.
hi. I have a question. Why did he spend the 2 years? Why did they allow him to spend 2 years before they proceeded with executing him?
Well, probably because there's lots more interesting things to do than to hold a religious trial about a fanatic. In the capital of Rome, who knows what all's going on, and who knows what the emperor is doing. He doesn't have to see anybody ever if he doesn't want to. But what happens is that Paul is actually, he's under house arrest. So Paul's paying rent in a house, and he's just got a guard outside the door. And so, I mean, Paul's not stirring up trouble. He's not causing problems. He's not a flight risk. There's not anything pressing. And who knows what's in the brain of, Nero.
If nobody found him guilty of anything, why was he being held?
That's right. That's exactly right. He appeals to Caesar. So he's got charges against him from the church. We don't know what Festus ended up writing. We don't know what Festus ended up writing, but we know that there's got to be something. And so maybe Festus just writes the religious charges that the church was putting down. We don't know what that is.
So when do we think Paul would have had time to go to Spain?
Those 2 years at some point in time. They're saying 64, 65 is what most scholars say, that if that happened, that's when it would happen, that he made it, that he was part of, after in 63, when Nero burns Rome, and why he does it, there's all kinds of stories. But Nero sets fire to the city. He blames it on the Christians. Although Nero is the one who did it, he said, I didn't do that. I'm emperor. That those fanatics called Christians. Well, he would have had all kinds of fanatic religious people in Rome. It's a huge city. People believe in this God and that God and whatever else. Nero picked the Christians. And so when he does that, starting in 63 AD, begins the official persecution of the Christian church. And over the next 30 years, it gets really, really, really bad. And so if Paul was set free and survived the fire, he probably would have had to flee because of the persecution. And Spain, he's written, or in several of his letters, he writes about what we call Spain, but he calls the westernmost empire. He wants to go to the unknown lands to the west. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just a minute.
Okay.
I went on today after I finished the reading and started reading Romans, and I don't remember who wrote Romans, and I didn't look it up, but I was amazed at the difference of how that Jesus came to love and forgive. And then when I get to Romans, everything's about judgment and rules, or at least the first few chapters. Who wrote Romans?
Well, Paul is the traditional writer of Romans. There is some discussion, certainly among lots of theologians, about which of the letters, for instance, tradition says all the letters we have in the back of the Bible are written by Paul, but we know that some portion of them were written by scribes, or potentially even written by people who were followers of Paul and not necessarily he himself. That sounds weird to us, but that was a very common way to write something. I am writing in the influence of Paul. I am writing under the guise of Paul, but everybody knows that I'm not. So in Romans, if you look at the introduction to Romans, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, made to be an apostle, set apart for the God. So Paul's identifying himself. And so the church, and I say the church tradition has said that Paul writes that, and that it's probably a series of letters that's compiled into one. But that's what we have to do, is we kind of have to look at those pieces to see what it is. Like, for instance, if you were to look at 1st and 2nd Timothy, which are in the back of the Bible, Timothy was a friend of Paul's, and traveling companion and fellow leader of the church. You can read those two and you can tell that those are really personal letters from Paul to Timothy. And Paul talks about some of their experiences together and encourages. You can see it's kind of a mentor who is trying to, and Paul's in prison when he's writing it. And Paul knows that his time is running out, whatever time that is. And so there's plenty of discussion on that. I typically don't pay a whole lot of attention to the exact authorship until they can say without a doubt, we know that Barnabas wrote this, or we knew that one of Paul's students wrote this, or a student of Peter's wrote this. It's kind of hard to, because we don't know.
Just the flavor of Romans was so totally different from Acts, and it just kind of threw me.
Well, Acts is written by Luke. It's not written by Paul. So Acts is written by Luke. The Gospel of Luke and Acts were the same book. And so you can read the Gospel of Luke and then skip to Acts, and it's the same language. It's the same verbiage. Paul's letters are different. And that's what scholars look to, is they look to, okay, what's the language that Paul's using in this letter? And oh my goodness, chapter 5, it changes language. Was that a separate letter, or did somebody else come in and write this portion? That is among scholarly debate all over the place. So. Well, all right. Well, thank y'all so much. Thank you for sticking it out, for sticking around. And this has been great. I have learned an awful lot in this class, and I hope y'all have enjoyed it. And of course, these classes are online as well. This is the last of our classes here. We'll start up something. I don't know what, but we'll start up something here a little bit later on in the summer. But if you'll just kind of follow with the chapel's information and the newsletter and that kind of stuff, I'll tell you in plenty of advance when we're going to start the next one. And again, if you're interested in going to Greece with the chapel, just contact us at the chapel office, and we'll help get you in touch with the people and get the information to you. So thank you so much. It's great to see you, and I pray that y'all are well. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pastor. Happy
Thank you.
Easter.
Thank you.